So Matthew says that he'll be dealing with our most important resource, which is soil. And why is it important? Because what we eat is basically very dependent on soil. And what I've done for this few slides is just put a few things that he's written about in the first few chapters. So we've got very little good soil on Earth. Only 7.5% of the land on the Earth's surface is suitable for agriculture. The rest of it is too wet, too dry, covered with cities and whatever. So we've got fairly limited space on which to grow our crops. And it's not valued by humans. About 40% of the world's agricultural land is no longer fertile and has been abandoned. 40 to 50% of the current agricultural land is seriously degraded. We lose a soccer pitch of soil every 5 seconds due to erosion or desertification. And if current soil management practices continue, we'll only have about 60 years of topsoil left. So it's a pretty sad situation. I won't read all that out. You can have a look at it yourself. It's just telling us the enormous amount of soil that we lose in Australia from water erosion. We lose topsoil at a rate which far faster than what we can actually. It takes a long time to make good topsoil, and we're losing it at a greater rate than it's being made. About half our topsoil has disappeared since Europeans arrived. The glaciers of New Zealand are periodically stained by red and black dust from Australia. Globally, since humans commenced farming, an area greater than the USA and Canada has been lost to soil erosion. So enormous areas of good soil have been lost. I've always thought New Zealand was in pretty good shape and that, pretty healthy sort of in terms of soils, but 2/3 of all rivers are unswimmable due to nitrogen runoff from dairy farms. Copper, which is used as a fungicide in the vineyards, has accumulated in the soil. China's I didn't put all the things he says about China, but that's a massive amount of pollution along the coastline. Europe, enormous areas of land need remediation because of all the cadmium, chromium, copper, mercury, and all the other things that have accumulated in the soil. More examples of contamination. In the US, 12 million tonnes of nitrogen and 4 million tonnes of phosphorus fertiliser applied per annum, and half of it finishes up in waterways. 500,000 tonnes of pesticide are applied per annum. And in samples from streams, virtually everything has got pesticide in both water and in fish. So. Salt in Australia, Western Australia, when we remove trees from the landscape, the water table rises and carries the salt with it. Massive salt pans scattered across the landscape in Western Australia, and we've lost 1 million hectares of agricultural land due to salt. Now, I guess nitrogen fertiliser is the thing that really keeps the world fed. But it's really one of the things that's turning the world brown. It decreases microbial activity and it's deadly on soil organisms. 60 to 70% of the nitrogen applied is not used by plants. It finishes up in waterways, and there's massive numbers of dead zones that are occurring in oceans. And nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, is always emitted. So we may have finished up in the last 40 or 50 years increased food supply, but it's resulted in a far less stable soil ecosystem. So that's what Matthew in this book, when he starts, all of those things are in this book. And then you start talking about the organisms in soil. I really like this book here, Teeming with Microbes. It's written for gardeners, but the same principles hold whether you're in a garden or on a farm. And it's just a very down-to-earth expose on all of the different organisms that occur in soil. There's a chapter on each, and the chapters are only 4 or 5 pages long, so it's not hard to read them. And so I think that's one way that people can get a better understanding of what's happening in soil. The problem we have in soil is that it's a massively diverse ecosystem, and most of the people who study them are specialists. So I work on nematodes. Most of you people are interested in fungi. Over here, there's a guy called Dave Water. I don't know whether you know Dave. He's an acarologist that lives in Gympie. Now, we're all specialists and we tend to focus on our own little world, but I think we've got to remember that soil is more complex than that, and that you've really got to start thinking about that whole system and how everything's interacting. And that's really difficult because you never get an acarologist, a nematologist, a mycologist, and bacteriologist working together, unfortunately. But if we're going to get our head around that complex system and how everything's interacting, I think we need to start working towards that. There's many organisms and many different roles, and I've just listed some of those roles here. You know, I won't really go through it in detail, but the bacteria and fungi are certainly the most important in terms of decomposing the organic matter that finishes up in our soils. Then you've got symbiotic relationships between organisms and plants, and then you've got the organisms that go through and fragment organic matter, break it up so that the fungi and the bacteria can get hold of it. And you've got all these ecosystem engineers that go into the soil and move organic matter around in the profile and do all sorts of other things. So when you're looking at that soil picture, you know, you can't just think of fungi. You know, the fungi are certainly important, but they're only one part of a very important system. So I'm just going to run through just one slide on each of those groups. And some of you probably know more about some of those things than I do. But certainly bacteria are the most numerous organisms in soil, massive numbers. And they decompose organic matter. They'll jump on any of that organic matter when it first arrives and decompose all the easy to decompose things. But they also fix nitrogen, and they transfer ammonium to nitrate, for example. So they have a whole range of different roles in soil. What used to be called actinomycetes, the actinobacteria, really, you know, they're bacteria that look like fungi, basically, and they have a major role in improving the health of the soil. They decompose organic matter, and again, it's, you know, the hard to decompose things like lignum and cellulose and chitin, which is you know, the eggshells of nematodes, for example, have chitin. Some of the arthropods have chitin in them. And so you need something you can decompose those. And they are also very important in terms of inhibiting the growth of plant pathogens. You people probably know more about fungi than I do, but they are really important in terms of degrading the hard to decompose materials like lignin and cellulose. And in some natural environments, there's massive numbers of amounts of fungi in soil. 2-3 kilometers of hyphae per gram of soil, for example. And if we didn't have fungi, the world would just be covered with a massive blanket of debris, organic debris. Protozoa, you know, we're slightly getting a little bit larger, and there's a whole range of different protozoa. They need moisture to move, so they reside in water-filled pores. And there can be enormous numbers of those protozoa in soil, and they all feed on bacteria. And basically, you know, I can't remember I reading somewhere, you know, enormous numbers of bacteria they can consume in a day, basically. And together with the bacterial feeding nematodes, which I'll talk about later, they play a major role in mineralizing nutrients such as nitrogen. And what we've forgotten is that in our natural systems, plants don't need fertilizer because the organisms in soil are doing it for us. And we've completely walked away from that knowledge in agriculture today. Nematodes, the most numerous multicellular animals on Earth. I always put that up because the entomologists always claim that they're number one, but nematodes beat them hands down. Some are plant parasites, and that's the other problem we have as humans, that we always focus on the bad ones, the ones that cause damage to plants, and forget about the 95% of good ones that we've got in soil. and I'll talk about those a bit later, but there are nematodes that feed on bacteria, fungi, some are predators that feed on other organisms, and we often forget about those good organisms. The microarthropods, enormous numbers of them as well. They range in size from, always, you need a microscope to see most of them. They also live in pore spaces. Some are predators. They also decompose plant organic materials and other things. And again, much like a lot of these other things, they regulate populations of other organisms, and they mineralize nutrients. Now we're getting into things that I don't know very much about, but I'll just run through them. Untitled worms, they're not really earthworms, but they do much the same sort of thing as earthworms. And in some environments, they're actually far more important than earthworms in terms of moving organic matter around in the soil profile. Symphalids, I've worked on symphalids in pineapples here, where they actually will feed on roots, but most of them are beneficial and generally sort of feed on all sorts of different organisms. So again, we tend to focus on a few that might be attacking roots of plants, but again, forget the fact that most of them are beneficial and are eating other organisms in this very complex soil food web. Tardigrades, water bears, amongst the most resilient organisms that we know about, can survive extreme temperatures and pressures and so on. And they also feed on plants and bacteria, but some are also carnivores. So again, wide range of different types. And I guess when you read books like this, they certainly mention the ones that are feeding on the roots, but basically what they're saying is if you make sure you've got a very diverse and active soil biological community, they'll keep these pests under control. The macrofauna, as we're getting larger, we'll get millipedes, centipedes, and isopods and things. Some are certainly problems. The cane grubs, they've spent a massive amount of money trying to control cane grubs and sugarcane. But again, most of these larger organisms are predators and prey on some of those other organisms that are in soil. Ants and termites. I think the interesting thing I find about them is this study that was done in Western Australia. It found that ants and termites increased water infiltration, improved soil nitrogen, increased wheat yields by 36%. So these things are ecosystem engineers. So they're moving through the soil, creating pore spaces in the soil. And you need that to get aeration into the soil so water can run into the soil. And so they're doing much the same as earthworms. And so that paper says that in Western Australia, and I was reading in this book here, the same thing. They said the ants and termites are really doing what earthworms do in fairly hot, dry environments. So you don't get earthworms in those hot, dry environments. It's the ants and termites that are doing the same sort of thing. Earthworms, again, quite a lot of different types of earthworms. Some that live just in the surface soil, some that go deep down into the profile, but they play a massive role in moving organic matter around through the soil profile and redistributing organic matter, and also creating sort of holes in the soil where with the water can and the air can penetrate. And Charles Darwin in 1981, I won't read it out, but he was pretty impressed by earthworms and thought they were very important in terms of where they fit in the ecosystem. Okay, so that's just a very quick rundown of the organisms that we have in soil. Now, what are they doing? So fungi and ecosystem engineers influence soil physical properties. So aggregation, you need soil particles to aggregate into particles because that creates some structure in the soil, allows water to move through the soil, air to move through the soil. So these organisms create pore spaces, increase water infiltration, improve drainage. So when we get 100 millimeters of rain, we want that water to run into the soil and stay in the soil. We don't want to to run off and take all the soil away and erode the soil. So there's a whole range of organisms that are helping to do that. The fungi, like mycorrhizal fungi, are producing glomalin, for example, which is binding soil particles together. And the macro, we get these big holes caused by the earthworms. How many earthworms do you reckon you should have per square metre of soil in a good, healthy soil? Anyone got a guess? 100? Up? A bit more? We talk about 250, but if you think about it, if you've got a 20 centimetre wide spade and you dig a hole 20 centimetres square, you should see about 10 earthworms in a healthy soil. Then multiply that by 25 to get the number per square metre. It's 250. And I spent a bit of time when I was working on sugarcane around Bundaberg, probably 10 years ago, where we made major change to the farming system. And I was getting 180 to 200 earthworms per square metre in some of the farms that were doing the right thing. So, and that number's not a magic number. It's going to vary with environment, but it gives you some idea of what you should be seeing in a healthy soil. Earthworms improve soil fertility, or the casts that they produce have a massive amount more nutrient in them than the soil around it. 7 and 11 times more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than the surrounding soil. Arbuscular and mycorrhizal fungi have many important roles. When everyone talks about the fact that they pick up things like phosphorus and completely forget the fact that they enhance disease resistance by preventing or competing with pathogens that are trying to access plant cells. They act as an extension of the root system. That's Marcel's diagram down there of a mycorrhizae, just showing that when those fungi are in the soil, they're extending out, picking up water and creating a root system that's far larger than it would have if those mycorrhizae weren't there. And then they're producing glomalin, which is the super glue that's causing soil to aggregate. So very, very important and many different roles. And I asked a question at the last meeting about mycorrhizae because agronomists in Australia completely ignore the fact that mycorrhizae are doing this sort of thing, unfortunately. Free-living nematodes. The most important thing they're doing is they're providing plants with nutrients. So most of the nutrients in soil are in the bodies of soil organisms. And those nutrients are in an organic form, in the proteins and that in the bodies of the organisms. So plants can't get hold of that. So free-living nematodes produce those into an inorganic form that can be taken up by plants. So this is an explanation of how that happens. So this bacterial feeding nematode has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 6:1, whereas bacteria only have a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 4:1. So this nematode has eaten 12 bacteria. So it's got 4 carbons and 1 nitrogen from that one, 4 and 1 from that one. It's got us 4 from there. So now it's got its 6:2, 12 to 2 or 6:1 ratio. It doesn't need that extra nitrogen. So that's the nematode poo. That is excreted, and that's in ammonium form, and then bacteria mineralize it to nitrate, and that's taken up by plants. So basically the nitrogen not required is excreted by the nematode and it is used by plants. And so the way our plants in a natural ecosystem like a forest or a grass pasture are getting their nitrogen is through the feeding activities, things like nematodes. Now, it's not just nematodes, protozoa eat bacteria, the same thing's happening. Everything's eating something else. There's nutrients excreted and used by plants. So this mineralization process is really, really important in a healthy soil to keep our plants growing. And it's something we've completely walked away from in agriculture, unfortunately. And all people think about is how many tons of nitrogen they've got to put on their farm every year to get a crop. Some organisms cause disease. And as a plant pathologist, I've had to work on some of those. Just some examples, some bad nematodes, bacteria, fungi, oomycetes. But most organisms actually suppress disease. And that's just some examples here. There's an example, Phytophthora and Pythium are really major root pathogens, but you can see this bacteria is producing something that's stopping that growing. That one there is not. So there's antibiotics produced by these things that actually keep these fungi under control. I'm not sure whether you can see those little worms in there. They're nematodes. You can actually buy those nematodes and spray on your, and they, in the turf industry, they buy these nematodes, spray them on the turf to kill this African muck beetle larvae. Metarhizium, one of the fungi that attack root pests. So a whole range of things that that attack some of the pests. If you're looking after soil, you'll have all these organisms in them, and they'll be helping to control them. As I said, my interest is nematodes. That's Pasteurella, which is a bacteria that's very similar to Bacillus. In fact, it was called Bacillus until the 1970s. It's got endospores, which are attached to the cuticle of the nematode. Then they bore into and penetrate the nematode and kill it. And this is a paper we published in 2017. And sugarcane, every sugarcane farm in Queensland has a nematode parasite called Predatory root lesion nematode. And we found a couple of farms where there was a lot of this bacteria actually killing the nematodes. That's a dead nematode there, completely full of that Pasteurella spores. Nematode-trapping fungi, they actually evolved in rotting wood. And the reason, when you're living in wood, it's got a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. A lot of carbon, very little nitrogen. And in this low nitrogen environment, they said, oh, okay, let's get some nematodes. We'll catch some nematodes to get the nitrogen. And so that's why they are trapping these nematodes. And providing you have a soil that's got plenty of carbon in it, either as a surface mulch, or you've incorporated or grown a lot of plants in the system and kept the carbon levels relevant, you'll have a lot of these nematode-trapping fungi helping to control some of the bad nematodes. Predatory mites. I mentioned Dave Walter a few years ago. He actually worked at UQ in the 90s and then went to Canada. And when I got a research grant in about 2014, I emailed and said, I've always wanted to work on mites and see what they do against nematodes. And I said, if I send you some, can you help me out and to give him some ideas? And he said, in 2 weeks' time, I'm coming back to Queensland to retire. And so he didn't really retire. We did a bit of work, and we worked on this mesostigmatic mite. And it's amazing, you know, the number of nematodes that mite would eat. It was 20 to 60 nematodes per day. Marcel, who can look after anything like that, you know, kept to feed these mites nematodes just to keep them alive till they had enough to do some experiments. And they did an amazing job at controlling the nematodes. So again, if you've got the right organisms in the soil, they'll help control some of these bad ones. So I guess to summarize, soil organisms must be nurtured because they provide many important ecosystem services. I've got them in 4 different colors there, just to sort of give you an idea of the wide range of things that they're actually doing. I won't read it out. You can have a bit of a look at it. Sequestering carbon, you know, we all know what's happening in terms of that. If we can look after the soil, we start to get some carbon back into the soil rather than sending up to the atmosphere. So we've known about these sort of things for many, many years, but we're a long way from actually putting it into practice and learning, using what we've learned to actually put it into practice in agriculture. Agricultural soils are in poor health because many of the practices we use are detrimental to these organisms. And I'm just going to run through a few of those. And tillage is certainly the worst. Every time you till the soil, and you know, it wasn't that long ago, you know, we used plows, rotary hoes everywhere, and they destroy the fungi. They are detrimental to the microarthropods, and a lot of the predatory nematodes, for example, are large. They're 2 or 3 millimeters long. So it's the big organisms that get knocked off, and the smaller ones survive. So tillage is really, really bad. It kills earthworms, destroys biocontrol agents. So certainly tillage is by far the worst agricultural practice we use. And I drive up to Gatton and I look at those vegetable farms around Gatton. And they, they've either got a crop in them or they've been tilled. So they've got a long way to go in terms of getting a healthy soil. Farm machinery causes compaction problems. When I started working on sugarcane in the 1990s, the old row spacing was 1.52 or 5 feet. And a sugarcane farm machinery has 1.85 and 1.85 metre wheel spacing. So when you drive that through those sort of things, you're compacting most of the soil. And we know that when the soil strength reaches 2,000 kilopactors or more, the roots find it very difficult to push their way through that soil. So all of this soil is compacted. There's only a little bit in the middle, which is about 25 centimetres deep and 20 centimetres wide, where the soil is in reasonable condition for the plant. So that's an absolute disaster, and there's plenty of examples of compaction like that one there, where most of that soil is completely compacted. Everyone knows what we used to do with sugarcane. We used to burn it and send it up and send all that carbon to the atmosphere. And even today, you can go along and buy cane mulch from a Bunnings or whatever. That should be staying on farm, in my opinion, but it doesn't in a lot of cases. But in addition to providing carbon inputs, which are vital in terms of getting a soil healthy, it's protecting the soil from water and wind erosion. It's improving soil moisture conditions by stopping that evaporation of moisture, dampening temperature fluctuations. So, if that soil was bare, it might go up to 30 degrees in midsummer. With that mulch on, it might only go up to 26 degrees. So that's quite important in terms of the soil organisms. And it's also providing a home for a wide range of soil organisms. Organic carbon levels in agricultural soils have declined by 60 to 80%. This is just an example of a guy up in the Vertican who actually cleared some land in 1983. And for some reason, he was wise enough to actually measure the carbon content of the soil before he cleared. He grew maize for seven years. You can see what happened. Went from about 1.3 down to 0.6 in 7 years, and then continued on. It's now gone on to sugarcane. And that's very typical of every agricultural situation. You read the literature. Back in the sugarcane was first grown here in Australia in the 1860s and 70s, and by the 1890s, we lost most of the carbon. They were starting to have real problems. So it doesn't take long when you start farming soil to lose the carbon that has been there for many, many years. And the carbon is the food source that's supporting this biological community we're talking about. Fertilizers. Everyone uses fertilizers these days, but that will, the more nitrogen you put in, the less fungi you'll have. These big omnivorous nematodes that are very important from a soil health perspective, they're actually very sensitive to nitrogen and they tend to die. High phosphorus levels are detrimental to mycorrhizal fungi. So, and the worst case scenario is high nutrient puts at a single time. So if you have to use fertilizer, it's far better to put little on and do it often. And of course, there's a cost of that because it takes time to do that. But certainly fertilizers are also one of the main reasons we're destroying our soils. Then of course there's pesticides. And there's a really good review article by a guy from the University of Sydney that really pretty well says that virtually every pesticide we use has some negative impacts on some organisms. And there's just an example, this imidacloprid, which is used as an insecticide, decimates earthworm populations, detrimental predatory arthropods, and also toxic to honeybees and so on. Copper, I mentioned that earlier, it's often used. There are avocado orchards that have been sprayed with copper for 40 or 50 years, and you can't find an earthworm in those soils anymore. Soil fumigants, which are often used against nematodes, sure they kill the nematodes, but they kill everything. And so you've got a biological vacuum. So a lot of things that we're, and of course, companies can get their products registered, and they don't have to actually show what they're doing to all these things. And that's, to me, ridiculous, but that's the way the system operates. As long as it kills the pests that they want to kill, they can get it registered, but they don't have to show what its negative impacts might be. And I think still that the vegetable industry is far behind most other industries in terms of making changes that are really necessary. Virtually everything they're doing is wrong. They fumigate the soil and kill everything. They sometimes use black plastic or white plastic on the beds, and they have a sort of solarization effect. They heat the soil up to a temperature that might be 45, 50 degrees, so it's killing some of the bad things, but it's also killing the good ones. They use nematicides. They do a massive amount of tillage, and they have long periods of bare fallow. That's taken in Bundaberg, but you can go anywhere at certain times and you'll see all that. Growers finish their year in November. They knock off for Christmas, and their next planting will be in February. So they leave the land bare fallow for 3 months. No plants, nothing in the soil. So everything. Sure, some of the pest nematodes, for example, will decline, but all the good ones do too. So we've got to start thinking about managing our soil. So we finish up with a food web like this, and this is actually a Mycological Society book that I borrowed a few weeks ago, but that I think is the best food web diagram I've ever seen. It's in that book. Just shows what we should be having in a healthy soil. So how do we restore the health of our soil? So the two books I've been talking about, they go into some of the organisms. In this one, they're talking about all the bad things we're doing. But the last half of the book, in both cases, tell us how do we look after our soil? What can we do to improve the situation? So by all means, have a look at those or buy them and have a look at them. And hopefully they'll tell you the sort of things that you can do in your garden or in agriculture. I've been working sort of in the soil health area for many years, and to me, these are the key things we have to do. The ones on the left are the key practices. If you've got a farm that's been badly farmed for many years, the first thing you do is these things here. Once you've done those, then you can start looking at these second tier practices. But you've certainly got to stop tilling or use reduced tillage, continuous inputs of organic matter from plants, a permanent cover of plant residues on the soil surface, a diverse rotations. A lot of agriculture is, we've got to, only grow 2 or 3 crops, and there's just no diversity there at all. And in a natural system, you'll have tremendous diversity. So you've got to start thinking about how you can get some diversity into your system and avoidance of compaction. So once you've done those things, then you can start looking at these, which will then gradually improve that situation. So what I'm going to do is just to finish off with is I'm just going to show you a few examples of people who've made a start. So this is Grapevines in South Australia. And you can see this is Yolumba Wine Company. Straw purchased from local farmers forms a mulch layer around the base of the vines. They grow pasture grasses in the middle of the row so that there's always some inputs of carbon into the system. They also apply compost to increase carbon levels. And they try and reduce compaction, but they use motorbikes that have balloon tires. And the sprayers that they use to spray, they straddle two rows rather than one, so that they don't actually have to, they don't have to go down every row. So that's just one example of a vineyard in South Australia that's making an effort to improve the health of the soil. I lived in Loxton in South Australia in the 1970s. It's 10-inch rainfall a year. It's on the edge in the Murray Mallee. And every 2 or 3 years, half of Australia's soil used to blow across in the dust. And you probably can remember in the 70s and 80s, massive dust storms. Fortunately, we've made major changes in the grains industry. Conservation agriculture has been widely introduced, and would probably 90, 95% of growers use conservation agriculture. And its principal components are no-till or minimum till, crop rotation, and retention of crop residues on the soil surface. So you can see that's been harvested, but a lot of that stubble has been left behind. And you can see that's a new crop being sown, and there's just a lot of organic matter still left, hasn't been tilled. And it's a far, far healthier system than what we used to have. And it's prevented a lot of that loss of soil from wind erosion. They've still got a long way to go. They're still using fungicides, they're still using massive amounts of nitrogen, but at least they've made the first change, which is at least helping to just restore the soil. I worked on a sugarcane system from about 1995 to 2004, the best research project I've ever been involved in. We had about 10 research scientists working in it and basically completely changed the way they grow sugarcane. So I mentioned earlier about the bed spacing. It used to be 1.5 metres and we changed to 1.85. Now, we argued with the industry for about 3 years about that. Oh, you can't, you go out to 1.85, you're going to lose yield. Well, you did lose probably 5 or 10% in the first year, but after that, you caught up and went ahead. And so it took a long time to convince the industry to make the change. But once you've made that change, then you use soybean, plant soybean. Soybean produces nitrogen, and there's so much nitrogen you don't even have to put nitrogen on the plant crop when you plant it. Then you plant the sugarcane into an undisturbed bed, so you don't. When you harvest the soybeans, they're still on the soil surface. Plant your sugarcane, and you finish up. You can see that you can see here, but there's still organic matter beneath the sugarcane there. And you can grow minimum till sugarcane. When you're finally finished after 4 or 5 years or however long you want to grow your cane, you spray it out with herbicide. And I guess some people will argue that's bad, but at this stage that's the only option. It's certainly better than tilling anyway. You spray out the herbicide and replant with soybeans. And in some years, some growers have probably made far more money out of soybeans than they have out of cane. It just depends on prices and what they have. There's a grower I work with up near Harvey Bay who I've got a photograph of him in the book that I wrote, and he's wrapped in the sugarcane rotation. So that's sugarcane. There was a vegetable grower up at Gympie that I photographed at his place, and he actually didn't do it because he wanted to improve the health of the soil. He had very sloping land, and if he didn't do this, all his soil would have washed away. And so it just shows you what you can do if you cover crop, you mulch, you plant into the mulch, and have permanent ground cover. His soil was far better than any other vegetable grower that I've ever worked with, and it's simply because he was just, it took him a few years to work out how to do it, but he certainly had a system that was sustainable in the long term. So that's basically it. That book, which I've got over there, that's all of that stuff that I've talked about, and those examples are there if you want to read about them and learn any more. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. So the question is whether if you grow the plants in hydroponics rather than in soil, the nutrients in the plant's different. And I'm not sure that I could answer that question, but actually, if in this book here, Matthew Evans talks a lot about the fact that the way we're using our agriculture and the sort of the high nutrient inputs that we're making is the food is nowhere near as nourishing as it used to be in the days where we had a more natural system. So I assume in a hydroponic system where basically you've just got fertilizers there, it would be exactly the same. You wouldn't have that taste in that, but I don't know, I'm not a food guru, so I couldn't comment anymore, but there is a few comments about that in that book if you'd like to have a look at them. Any other questions? Yeah, so the question is Gabe Brown, I have heard the name. He's part of the regenerative agriculture movement. It says that by keeping a diversity of plants on the soil surface, you can actually start to make soil more quickly. And I think that's correct. The more biomass you can produce and the more diversity you can have there, you'll get some plants that have roots that might go down a metre. Other plants tend to be surface dwellers. So having a diversity of plants, those carbon inputs are going to different places in the soil, and so I would have think. And the other thing about regenerative agriculture that we've lost in our agriculture system today is keeping animals in the system. So basically, we used to have mixed farms throughout Australia, but in the last probably 30 years, we've moved from mixed agriculture to mixed farming to continuous cropping. And when you've got animals in the system, all the manure and that goes back into the soil, and you're only just occasionally taking an animal away and killing it. But that's a far healthier system, and the pastures that are there are far healthier than they are in a cropping system. I did some work a few years ago with a guy at Tamworth in New South Wales, and we actually compared, the pasture soils in that Tamworth area to the cropping soils, and that pasture soils are miles more healthier. And it's because you've got a diversity of plants in the system and you've got animals in the system. So that system that these regenerative agriculture people are talking about, certainly there's evidence that it does work. I'm not sure what, I've never had anything much to do with permaculture, but the question is about permaculture. I'm not sure that, can you do that? Can you grow crops in a permaculture system? Do you know? No, I don't know. I guess, there's always sort of people on the edge who've got all these ideas, but I think ultimately, if what you've got to do is convince most of the growers that they need to move. And it took from the mid-80s to probably 2005, 2010 to get 80 or 90% of the wheat growers in Australia to move from the old system to the new. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And so if someone's got an idea that permaculture is going to work, they need to convince a lot of people before you'll see any benefit anyway, except in that particular place. So the question is, I'm covering my soil with something that's going to have holes in it. So what's the something? I can't see that would be detrimental. But the important thing is, have you put some organic matter in the system? Are you going to grow plants in the system, and how are they going to behave with this mesh above them and all those sorts of things? So I assume they'll be able to grow up through that mesh, and if they do that, that's fine. But right, But the most important thing is organic matter. If we've got to address that situation of losing all that carbon, and you start to increase the carbon levels, you're going to have all sorts of biology. It'll vary with your soil type and what you're growing, but carbon is the number one thing you really need to think about. And, if putting a whole lot of compost is the easy way of doing it, we'll start with that. Yeah, the one at the back. So that was that nematode that is used in the turf industry. So there's a group in CSIRO in Canberra who in the 1980s did a lot of work on these insect parasitic nematodes. They probably led the world in that area. And I think this company is a spin-off from that. And you can buy those nematodes and spray them on your turf and kill these things like the African black beetle. I've run a couple of master classes for turf superintendents in the last couple of years, and I said, do you use this stuff? No. Why don't you use it? We knock off at 2 o'clock. We start at 5 o'clock in the morning and knock off at 2 o'clock. You've got to put these nematodes out in the evening because they need water, and they'll only move if there's moisture. So you put them out at 6 or 7 o'clock, and they've got moisture during the night, and they can go and find their target things. So no, you can't use it because they can't work at 6 or 7 o'clock in the afternoon. So I've got a few slides from another presentation I've done about these, but it depends. Apparently, I know nothing about African black beetles, but apparently, they're in the turf industry. They tend to sort of start to appear about November, and then that's the first or second stage instar, and then later on in January you get the and so the people who sell this product can tell you, it's better to apply it this time or that time. So I guess the main thing is to get it out at a time when there's moisture around so they can move, and then target the particular thing at the right time. And that, as I said, I'm not an expert on which time is the best time, but certainly I could give you the name EcoGrow is the company that's selling this stuff, and they would be able to tell you how to use it. Yeah. So there's two nematodes, Steinonema and Heterorhabditis, and what they do, it's very smart. Like, the nematodes carry a bacteria, and they enter the insect. They're bacterial feeding nematodes. They enter the insect, and then the bacteria multiply in the insect, and suddenly they've got an insect that's full of bacteria. And all the nematode has to sit there, and it's got a food source there for days. So it's pretty smart. Yeah. So they're not really predatory. They're actually taking the bacteria into them. Bacteria is doing the job, and it's the food source of them. Yeah. So there's So in my turf talk, there's 6 or 7 insects that are fairly common on turf, and they target one insect with that particular nematode, another one with that. So so they've done all the research to tell you which one does the best against which insect. Yeah. Interact with fungi, fungal gnats. No, no. So these fungal gnats, they feed on fungi, do they? Or I don't know. I guess I'm not aware of it, but no, there could be a lot of. I can remember that work that was done on these turf grass pests. It went for about 7 or 8 years, 4 or 5 people. You've got to get 4 or 5 people for 4 or 5 years to often answer those questions. And good job for you. You're young enough. Yeah. I do go first. Yeah. The questions about crop rotation in orchard systems. The big thing about orchards, though, is that they're it's a far better system in terms of agriculture. You're not tilling the soil. You saw that vineyard, for example. There's so you're not periodically changing the thing. So you get diversity in those systems by growing a pasture or something between the trees or vines. And so the more of that sort of thing you can do, the more biology you're going to get in that system. Yeah. The big problem, though, is a lot of the roots of the trees will be sort of under the canopy, and so you might have a really healthy soil out here in the interrow, but it might not be so healthy under the tree. And so that's where you've got to start thinking about throwing some organic matter or mulches or something like that into that part of it to perhaps help in that system. Yeah. But the other and the other thing with rotation is it's really, you've got to think about what you're trying to control. So I spent a lot of time in the 90s. Root knot nematode is a major pest of most crops, and we came up with forage sorghum varieties that are very resistant. So if you've got that is the major problem, then grow forage sorghum because it's resistant to the nematode. Populations drop dramatically. But in a citrus orchard where you've got a different nematode attack, that forage sorghum wouldn't work. So you need to think about something else. But yeah, certainly the main problems in perennial horticulture is when you replant. So you grow trees or vines for 20, 30, 40 years, and then you've got to replant. That's when you completely disturb the soil. And then you've got to then do the right thing if you want to actually replant and get a healthy plant again. You've got all these pathogens that are there that are ready to jump on that new plant. And there's a guy called Tom Forge in Canada who's doing some of the best work in that area that I'm aware of. They grow a lot of apples and cherries in British Columbia, and he's doing a lot of organic amendment work and that sort of thing to get those systems to operate effectively. No. As I said, I think sugarcane, for example, we developed that new system in 2004, I think, and in the first 3 or 4 years, probably 20% of the growers made the change. But a hell of a lot of sugar growers, they don't rely on the cane. They've got a job in town, and they might have a few acres of cane, they make it money. So you don't convince everyone. So I'm not sure now. It probably would only be 30 or 40% of the growers that are actually using it. So that's one of the problems. And I think in the vegetable industry, still got a massive amount, a long way to go. There's a funding body that all agricultural organisations have, funding bodies that fund research. There's a group in Sydney called Soil Wealth, and they get all the money. I don't know, they must talk to the funding body every second day because no one else ever gets the money. But their main role is to actually convince vegetable growers to make the change. And the problem with vegetables is, what they do in Victoria is different to what they do in Queensland. So there's a massive amount of work to demonstrate, because the grower's not going to change his system until you can show that it works and he can make some money out of it. And so you've got to have these field trials in different locations with different crops and how many different vegetable crops are there to make it work. So it's not something, so everyone wants to put this label sustainable on it, but hell of a lot of it's not sustainable, and particularly in the vegetable industry. Oh. What's the best way to reverse already poor soil? Would you attempt to reintroduce specific aspects, or just adding biomass is a good way to go about this? Yeah. I guess my is you've really got to stop tilling and increase your carbon level, which would be number 1 and 2 for me. There's a lot of, there's more biological products. There's massive numbers of biological products on the market, but unfortunately, there's very little scientific evidence that they are actually effective. And when you think about it, you can get a bacteria from New Zealand that they've developed that they reckon it's a great biocontrol agent, and bring it to Queensland. It was brought up in a temperature of 16 or 17 degrees. Stick it in Bundaberg at 25 degrees, it's not going to do very well. So it doesn't make, and then the other thing is when you're introducing an organism, it's got to compete with the organisms already there. And so most of them don't make it. They might be there for 2 or 3 weeks, but they're ineffective. So I'm not convinced that is the way to go. I think the way you've got to do is you've got a biology there that's been developed because it's in that soil type and in that environment, but you've got to start to build it up to a level where it's going to be useful. And I think stopping tilling and introducing organic matter and growing a range of cover crops. So some of the cane growers, for example, they're growing cover crops, but there's 6 or 7 species in those cover crops. So tremendous diversity there. That's a good thing, and that will really help. So I think that's the way to go. Yeah. What's the best way to reintroduce carbon? Well, plants first, but I guess ultimately you've got to make money out of the crop you're growing. But cover cropping is something that should be part and parcel of vegetable cropping, for example. You grow a crop for 3 or 4 months, then you go into a cover crop for 2 or 3 months, and it's expensive to bring in carbon from somewhere else. There are cane growers and sweet potato growers I work with in Coogin in New South Wales. They make their own compost. So if you can make your own compost on farm, then it doesn't have to come 100 kilometres away and cost you a fortune. So some people are able to do it, but certainly introducing compost and growing cover crops would be certainly the best ways of starting to increase the carbon in the soil. And it's not going to happen in 5 minutes. We've decimated our soil to the point where it's going to take probably 10 or 15 years to really get it back to where it should be. It's not going to happen in 5 minutes. You made the comment that some of these people claim they can do that, but in general terms, it takes a long time to get carbon levels back to where they should be.